Hello friends, this is the latest installment of our based book review series. Today we'll be covering a very important book. This is Charles Upton's System of Antichrist, Truth and Falsehood in Postmodernism and the New Age. Some years ago I covered another one of Charles Upton's works, Vectors of the Counter-Initiation. The book we'll be looking at today is actually a prequel to Vectors. If you're wondering why I covered the sequel before the prequel, the answer is that at the time I didn't know any better. Vectors was the first Charles Upton book I found, and that's why I decided to review it. Today I intend to correct my mistake from earlier. In his preface, Upton gives us a 10-point plan of what he hopes to achieve with this book. 1. To take soundings in the present religious and cultural scene from the standpoint of traditional metaphysics. 2. To introduce to a wider reading public the doctrines of the Traditionalist School, and in the process to give the reader a glimpse into the city of traditionalism and the field of spiritual battle presently surrounding us. 3. On the basis of traditional metaphysics, to critique the doctrines of the New Age spiritualities in the context of postmodernism, of which they are one expression. 4. To demonstrate in the course of this critique that metaphysics, mysticism, and esotericism are fundamentally different and radically opposed to magical practices, the pursuit of psychic powers, and the channeling of quote-unquote spirit entities. 5. To demonstrate to my Christian friends that they are not the only ones who see in neo-paganism and the New Age a decline in our culture's understanding of both God and man. 6. To present lore and prophecy relating to the latter days of the present cycle from the standpoint of comparative religion, drawing from relevant doctrines of Buddhism, Hinduism, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, Zoroastrianism, and the Native Americans. 7. To publish the signs and speculate upon the social, psychic, and spiritual nature of the being known as the Antichrist, to present him as both an individual and a system, to warn those willing to be warned against the spiritual seduction and terror he represents, and against the regime which will be and is the social expression of that seduction and terror. 8. To trace the roots of Antichrist in the forgetful and/or fallen nature of man. 9. To begin to define the particular quality of spirituality proper to apocalyptic times, the danger it faces, the unique opportunities open to it. And 10. To trace my own, that is to say Charles Upton's, course from the spiritual revolution of the 60s through the world of New Age spiritualities to the threshold of traditional esotericism and metaphysics. The key words in this book, besides of course tradition, are postmodernism, New Age, and Antichrist. How does the author understand these concepts, and how are they related to one another? It's difficult to discuss postmodernism without first addressing the age/historical movement which it emerged in response to, namely modernism. Modernism dates back to the Renaissance. It grew stronger during the scientific revolution of the 17th century and eventually became the dominant movement of the West, replacing the religious worldview of the Middle Ages. Upton categorizes modernity as materialistic, naturalistic, and progressivist. Modernists believe in humanity's grand design, which is both inevitable and desirable, a kind of terrestrial paradise envisioned by liberals, communists, eugenicists, and others. Postmodernism has its roots in the 19th century with thinkers like Kant, Nietzsche, and Kierkegaard. It came to dominate Western culture in the 20th century and radically departed with the assertions of modernism. There was no grand design, no overarching truth, no humanity, quote-unquote, as such. Truth is necessarily plural and subjective. What we call reality is not perceived, but constructed on the basis of the historical period, cultural background, and language of the people concerned with it. In other words, according to postmodernists, no truth, quote-unquote, can transcend its origin. If modernism sought to replace the traditional religious social authorities of the West with secular ones in pursuit of a new humanistic and materialistic telos for mankind, then postmodernism seeks to do away with dominant authorities and an overarching telos altogether. In the words of one of the leading postmodernist thinkers, Jacques Derrida, the very idea of truth is oppressive. If objective reality is illusory, then any attempt to promote or enforce a given truth is necessarily a power move. This conclusion led postmodernists to go out of their way to combat and deconstruct beliefs and cultural institutions which they perceived as hegemonic, in order to make room for the expression of beliefs and institutions deemed marginal. All of this is done in the name of diversity. Ultimately, however, the marginal cultures and diversity itself are devoid of any transcendent value, since any presumption of such value would go against the relativism and subjectivism that postmodernism strives for. Upton tries to draw a parallel between the epistemological nihilism of postmodernism and the traditional doctrine of divine ineffability. The ancient mystics, such as Pseudo-Dionysius, speak of an ultimate divine reality which lies beyond all thought and conception, but is nonetheless the source and foundation of everything that exists. In place of this supreme reality, postmodernism has as its principle a void of nothingness. For the author, the fact that such a degenerate doctrine has become widespread in our times is indicative of the present cycle of human manifestation approaching its end. Modernism has of course not disappeared. It still plays an enormous role in contemporary society and culture. But it is no longer the only show in town and does not predominate in the way that it did before. The contemporary zeitgeist is a mix between modernism and postmodernism, both of which are destructive to tradition. Modernism would deny the reality of any spiritual dimension to human life, whereas postmodernism would fight to undermine whatever is left of the legitimacy of revealed religion in contemporary society for the benefit of alternative spiritualities ranging from confused and absurd to the demonic and counter-initiatory. This is where the New Age comes into the picture. What exactly is the New Age? In a broad sense, it is the idea that truth can become new, that truth is somehow subject to evolution. This is a very heretical idea from a traditional point of view, where truth, aka God, is always the same even if cosmic conditions are subject to change. Upton claims that the current day incarnation of the New Age is an aspect of postmodernism. More specifically, it is postmodernism applied to the realm of religion and spirituality. The New Age is pluralistic, it celebrates diversity, it is opposed to a central orthodox authority, dogma and hierarchy. It is common for the followers of New Age not to remain loyal to a single master or spiritual belief, but to deliberately multiply them. Upton notes that there is a strong quantitative aspect of the New Age. The more gods and goddesses you believe in, the wider your consciousness, quote-unquote, gets. The New Age also promotes the idea of everyone being his own personal guru, that everyone can construct their own myth, something which is also very consistent with postmodern thought. The radical subjectivism and the adulterous mixing of traditional elements which characterize the New Age denies the practitioner any real chance of transcendence and limits them to the realm of psyche, one which is inferior to that of spirit, the home of true objectivity. Upton spends a good part of this book describing some of the main movements in the New Age and criticizing them. He dedicates special sections to the sorcery of Carlos Castaneda, Helen Schuckman's Course in Miracles, which Upton identifies as a neo-Gnostic work, the anti-Christian and pro-evolutionary Celestine Prophecy by James Redfield, as well as the commercial Hinduism of Deepak Chopra. The author is quick to point out that all of these works do in fact contain some amount of metaphysical and spiritual insight, but it is never complete. There is always enough falsehood and distortion in order to make them spiritually hazardous, if not outright toxic. When it comes to the Antichrist, Upton makes no serious attempt to speculate about his origin or the exact time of his rule. He assumes that the Antichrist will manifest as a human individual, something which many of the traditions seem to point to. But more importantly, the Antichrist is a metaphysical principle, whose temporary ascension to power is both necessary and inevitable. The kingdom of the Antichrist is not some sort of cataclysm that will befall humanity out of the blue. Rather, it is the logical conclusion to the cycle of human manifestation that the Hindus call Manvantara. In a sense, the Antichrist has been on his way since the fall of Adam, and the more humanity degenerates spiritually, the closer his empire draws. The postmodern age, with its decadent post-materialism and religious confusion, is the perfect plane upon which the system of Antichrist can be constructed. Contrary to what many on the reactionary side of politics might believe, Upton does not equate the current globalist world order to the emerging system of the Antichrist. The former is merely a precursor to the latter. The Antichrist, Upton writes, will be a being that is blind to the real spiritual matters, yet one that possesses great skills in problem solving and conflict resolution. He will undoubtedly mediate between the forces of globalism and those of the conservative reaction rising against it, and in a proper Hegelian fashion will propose a system that reaches a compromise between the two, satisfying their respective wishes on the conditions that they submit to his rule. This rule will be tyrannical to the highest degree and will likely make use of ingenious social technologies of control. Yet it will be ephemeral, for it is ultimately based on an illusion. Upton tells us that, quote, just as the ego is the shadow of the divine self within us, so the Antichrist is the shadow of the Messiah, of the eschatological Savior who represents the complete unveiling of the divine self at the end of this cycle. The ego will often reach a climax of despair, delusion, and violence just when a spiritual breakthrough is imminent. In the same way, the Antichrist will gather to himself all of the social and psychic forces which have willed to resist God, at the very moment the face of the Absolute is about to dawn upon the world. What are the main influences that Upton draws upon in writing this work? The most obvious influence comes from his fellow traditionalist authors, Genon, Kihwan, Coomaraswamy, and many others. Upton's criticism of postmodernism owes a lot to Huston Smith, someone who wrote a whole book criticizing postmodernism from a traditional point of view. Obviously, being a member of a Sufi order, Upton often references medieval sages of Islam, most notably Ibn Arabi. He also holds William Blake in high regard as a metaphysician and frequently cites him all throughout the book. Another name that Upton pays great respect to is C.S. Lewis, whose works, The Screwtape Letters and Hideous Strength, he makes use of on several occasions. In the section of the book dealing with UFOs, Father Seraphim Rose is mentioned in a very positive light. The work of UFO researchers Jacques Vallée and John Mack are discussed somewhat more critically. The parts of Upton's work that deal with sociology and the elite versus people dynamic rely heavily on the work of Christopher Lasch, who himself builds upon the philosophy of Ortega y Gasset. Reflecting on his writing style, Upton states that, quote, sometimes I write as a scholar, sometimes as a speculative theosopher, sometimes as a popularizer of basic metaphysical principles for the general reader, sometimes as a social critic, sometimes as an autobiographer, and sometimes as a poet. This book is not overly academic. It succeeds in presenting complex topics in a way that is as accessible as possible to the average reader. Obviously, the issues at hand can only be simplified so much, but even someone who is new to metaphysics will still understand most of this and will gain invaluable knowledge from System of Antichrist. Upton writes with sincerity and with strong conviction, but without arrogance. At one point in the book, he even allows the possibility that the various New Age circles may indeed contain genuinely holy people. This, however, should not get in the way of us pointing out and combating the various inconsistencies and outright falsehoods that the New Age brings forth. Who would I recommend this book to? Broadly speaking, I would recommend it to anyone interested in spirituality and esotericism, but especially to people who have fallen for many of the New Age movements, Theosophism, Spiritism, Wicca, magic, etc. I think this book does a good job of exposing the dangers of mystical pursuits outside the confines of an established religious tradition. I greatly recommend this work, as well as Vectors of the Counter-Initiation, to readers of Guénon. I think both of these works could serve as excellent companions to Guénon's magnum opus, The Reign of Quantity. Upton does a good job of illustrating and providing relevant contemporary examples of the ideas that Guénon presented in an abstract and theoretical fashion. One example of this is Upton's treatment of the UFO phenomenon in a spiritual context. This will be all for today. Thank you for watching.